When we are on the wrong path, there can be these signs that indicate that we need to go a different direction. Some of these signs are really obvious, they're really clear. However, there are other signs that are a little bit more subtle. And by becoming aware of some of these signs, it can allow us to properly understand whether or not we need to change or shift paths into something that is more aligned. And I want to talk about what some of these signs are, having worked with so many people on understanding and choosing the right direction when it comes to their own vocation and career path. And my name is Joel Yulee. I'm a philosopher. I am absolutely obsessed with vocations and callings. That's why I educate people here on YouTube, Substack. I host a podcast called the Career Archetypes podcast. That's why I founded an online community that shows and guides people how to choose the right career path with conviction by unearthing their very own career archetype. Because it's my belief that if you're not pursuing your calling, then you end up walking this path of resentment and regret. But to find your calling and to pursue it leads to a life of deep personal fulfillment, as well as being able to serve the right people that you're meant to be serving out in the world. And there are these different signs that show up when we're not pursuing the correct calling. And like I said, some are really, really obvious. They're clear. We're in deep pain. This has to change. But other signs, they're really, really subtle. And so I want to go over 5 of these more subtle signs so that you can start to tune in to whether one of them is something that's happening to you. And if it is, you can change directions. And so the first sign that is quite subtle is enrolling into a course or being coached by someone, and it feels kind of off. There's something amiss. And this can happen if you're enrolling, say, for example, into an online course, and you start going through the material, you start following what the instructor's saying or the educator's saying, and you're going through it. And as you're doing particular exercises or as you're listening to particular teachings, it's not quite sitting right. It feels as though it's taking you into a direction that doesn't quite work. And you might not be super aware of it. Like, it might not be super obvious that, hey, this isn't quite working, to the point where you might start doing these exercises, you might start going out into the world and putting out work that these courses are prescribing and telling you to do. Something's off. And becoming slowly attuned to this can help to open you up to, okay, something's going amiss here. What is it? Now, to ground this into a bit of an example, I remember I was in this online course. This was quite a few years ago. But in this course, it was on business. And I was trying to understand, what is business? What does this mean? How do I go about doing my own kind of business? Because I knew that I wanted to be a philosopher. I knew that I wanted to be able to earn some form of income from philosophy. And I thought that connecting into an online business would be probably the best route for me, because there was no one that was really going to hire me as a philosopher doing the things that I felt pulled towards. So I was learning about business. And as I was going deeper into this, one of the things that the instructor said was that they said, hey, you have to niche down. And you have to pick like a very, very select person or like target audience or something like this. And you've got to like zoom right in on this audience and no one else. And the way to find this is to think about, I think it was something like, what is your greatest gift? And then overlap that with what the world needs, and then bam, you have your niche. And it just felt really off to me. It just felt like this didn't quite fit with me. But because I didn't really know how to approach it, I started to like contort it into working. And I also noticed that other people within this course were also struggling with something very, very similar. Like, this wasn't quite working out for them. And this was a real introduction to me for the subtle sign of like, hey, you can't actually walk your path like this in this way. It actually has to be quite different. And so I ended up having to change. But all the signs were there. It was really, really subtle, because I felt as though a part of me was doing it wrong because it wasn't working out the way that the instructor was kind of telling us to do. And yet, by navigating away from it ended up leading me towards a way of doing things where I'm not having to do this whole niching down thing, and the signs were there. And so if you yourself are in an online course or you're being coached by someone and it's starting to feel off, you really want to reflect on why. Why does this feel off for me? What's going on here? And what actually happens is that a lot of people will continue pushing in these educational environments, whether that's within a university setting, whether they've poured a lot of money into an online course. They'll keep pushing because they've invested so much time and effort into it. So even when they're starting to feel like this isn't the right way, they'll keep going. They'll keep moving in a direction that they shouldn't be moving in anymore. And it's about paying attention to that. The other thing that can happen here is that people start to feel like this is off. And rather than reflect on why it was off, they'll leave it. They won't really reflect on it. And they'll just jump into another course. They'll jump into another coaching package. And they'll just say, well, now you sort me out. So they're not really doing the introspective work on themselves to become more attuned to their path and to their vocation. And you have to remember the vocation is so deeply personal that you can get guidance from these outside sources. Don't get me wrong. Other people can definitely provide useful information, knowledge, know-how. But fundamentally, the vocation is yours and it's unique to you. And if you're constantly listening to these outside voices and just trying to push you into the mold of what it is that they are saying, even when you feel like it's off, then it's not actually congruent with your vocation and your calling. Now, the second really subtle sign that I notice in people that are going the wrong direction is that they start to become a statue. And I call this statue syndrome. Now, typically this is rooted in people that have this real deep need to personally achieve. Now, this personal achievement can look different to people depending on upbringing, depending on schooling. It can look like wanting to achieve all the different awards. It can look like being really, really popular. There's a particular type of achievement that they're typically aligned with, but they're trying to achieve. And so they're so rooted in this personal achievement that is based on the feedback of others that they start to create this external person of who they're trying to show themselves as in the world, and they end up losing a sense of self. So they're constantly chiseling at this external image of themselves to the point where it's no longer them, to the point where it just becomes this sort of stale, lifeless figurine that's out in the world. And it gets the accolades, it gets the respect, it gets the applause externally, but internally they know that this just it's not them. It's so far from them. They've detached themselves from it, and they've bottled themselves, or their inner life has been bottled, where it's just not allowed to be released. And this causes this real deep inner pain. And I have two examples in my mind of this. I remember working with this guy, and very, very, very successful. Just your classic worldly success in the big fancy company, making the millions of dollars. And he was very dissatisfied with his work. And the reason for this was because he ended up creating this lifeless figure that looked the part, but internally he wasn't that connected to it at all. He wanted to be seen, expressed as someone completely different. I was also just speaking with a member within our online community, and I do these interviews every single week with different students that have just unearthed their career archetype. And this particular student, she had never known what it was that she wanted to be doing with her life, and she had always been moving in this direction of personal achievement to the point where she was always getting all the great grades. She was going to university. She was considering her PhD. And something was wrong. Something was amiss. And when she entered the program, she actually ended up having this dream whereby she was watching and seeing this statue that was completely lifeless. And one of the things that I asked her to do, and it's a bit deeper than this, but to connect into the primal energy, to connect into the deeper layers or deeper forces underneath the materialistic. And as she started to do this and go through this unearthing process, what ended up happening is that she ended up unearthing her career archetype, which was the Renaissance muse. And in that process, she ended up having this vision whereby the statue that she had previously seen actually started to come to life, right? It started to dance. And as she was able to go through this process, she was able to bring her life into the places, and she's still going through this process, but she started to bring this part of herself into the world, into existence. She was able to bring herself forward. And so rather than remaining a statue, which so many people do, unfortunately, it's just horrible to watch, because just so many people just lose themselves in this externalization of self, that she was able to connect into the life force underneath this, constantly having to achieve and constantly chiseling yourself into something that you're not, but you're putting out there because other people are saying that's how you should be, and being too tied to that. And one of the reasons that this is a subtle sign is because this can happen over a period of years, where you're slowly becoming more and more solidified, more and more statue-like, where people look at it and they say, like, well done, revere it, applaud it, clap it, but internally, it's not you. Now, the third subtle sign is this constant daydreaming of either quitting a job or alternatively a different type of life. And this might be on the bus as you're going to work, where you're just daydreaming, oh, what if I was living this other alternative life? One other way that this shows up a lot is when people joke offhandedly about quitting. Like, they're waking up and they're on the way to work and they're like, could you just imagine if I just quit right now? Could you just imagine if I just went on a holiday, and like, what would they do without me if I just left? Right? This kind of talk, this kind of chatter is often this subtle sign that indicates that something's not quite right, that there's something deeper that needs to be addressed. And to get there, you've got to look at it and confront it and go deeper on it. But that can be it can cause such a terror, because when you start to look at that stuff, it means that you might have to upend, transform, change your life. And people don't want to do that. People don't want to have to look at that and potentially rearrange themselves, both internally, but also their external circumstances. And so people avoid it. One place that I see this all the time, this was way back in the day, I did this stint, didn't last very long, but I did this stint and doing some tradie work. And just, I think everyone uses the word tradie. I don't know, I'm from Australia. So if I say tradie, all I mean is somebody that has a trade. I'm thinking plumbers, carpenters, somebody that is putting the roofers on top of your home, anything like that. And a lot of people that I bumped into that have trades really don't like doing it. They're doing it purely to survive, purely for the money. And there's a lot of joking that goes around. There's a lot of humor that goes around. And I often would notice, being in some of these environments, that people would joke to ease the pain of the current environment that they're in, not having to deal with, hey, I actually don't want to be here. And to try and leave is so difficult, so I'm just going to stay here. And one way that I'm going to deal with it is I'm just going to joke about it, or joke about things all the time. Like, there's this layer on top of the work and of the pain of joking around. And so if you're noticing that you're trying to joke to ease the pain, or if you're in work and you're trying to send memes all the time to ease the pain, this is a really, really subtle sign that, hey, you're trying to ease a deeper pain that you're not quite looking at, and maybe you need to look at that. Another way that this can show up on this point is oftentimes I would notice that people would fantasize about winning the lottery a lot in workplaces. And there would always be this conversation whenever the lottery was big and coming up within the month. And someone would say, like, what would you do? What would you do with all that money? And people would just say, like, I would go quit. I would just go sit on the beach. I would go, go lie down in the sun with a glass of some sort of drink with an umbrella out of it. And I would just be in absolute bliss. And that's what I would do. Some people would say, I might work maybe like one day a week, but that's it. And for the rest of the time, I'd just be hanging out and eating at delicious restaurants. And that's the type of life that was being thrown around amongst that fantasy of winning the lottery. Once again, this was the subtle sign of people trying to escape where it was that they are. One of the most fascinating things that happened to me when I started to actually walk my calling was I thought to myself, what would I be doing if I won the lottery? And all I realized was I would be doing the same thing. I think the only difference and the major difference that would occur was that I would use that money and put that money into more of my philosophy. And it would just be the same. And that was such a fascinating, strange thing to happen, because previously, if I had won the lottery, when I was within those sort of working environments, I would think like, yeah, I would totally want to go on a vacation, an extended break, just chill for a while. And yet when you're connected to your vocation, it's the opposite. You don't want to do that. You've got work to do. You've got a calling to pursue. It's such a different type of life. You don't really know that until you're connected into it. But this subtle sign of wanting to escape that life and fantasizing about it is something that needs to sort of come into awareness if you are doing that. Now, the fourth really subtle sign is when your interests are constantly fading and you're not aware of interests that are returning. Now, anyone that is a multi-passionate person that is interested in many different things, they're going to have different interests that are going to arise within their lifetime. They're going to come in, you're going to be curious about them, you're going to follow them, and that's amazing. You want to go ahead and follow these different interests because that will allow you to find these overlaps of uniqueness, meaning that there are going to be different sets of interests that you're going to run into, and they're going to spark up elements of creative insight into your own personal path. So you need these different interests. They're going to help you on your way. But when they're constantly fading off and you're not quite aware why they're fading off or why there's no sustaining force underneath, this can be a sign that you're on the wrong path, because what I call the career archetype, this base level pattern that resides within your soul, is this core foundational piece of the vocation. And from this, different interests are expressed. And so it's like your career archetype's at the base, and from this base, there are these different interests that are connected to that base, to that foundation. And so when you've got all these interests fading off, but you have no base, it means that you're disconnected from this part of your deeper self or your soul. And oftentimes what people end up doing is they'll just keep jumping from interest to interest to interest, and they won't go underneath it. They won't go and find the essence of each of those interests and find the thread that weaves them together, which is absolutely crucial if you want to understand more about why you're getting pulled into these different directions and what they're telling you about your path. Now, an interesting example that comes to mind is actually Carl Jung. And so Carl Jung, for those of you who don't know, is a very, very famous depth psychologist. He's the person that came up with these terms like extrovert and introvert, the collective unconscious, archetypes, and really brought forward these different ideas. And early on in his career path, he was really considering archaeology, going deeper, digging deeper, and bringing up these like physical treasures from the past world. And the interesting thing with him is that this interest faded away. It left him. But there were other interests within his vocation, his career path, that stayed, that kept on returning time and time again, pointing specifically to one interest, which was alchemy. he was constantly finding that the alchemical literature was giving him insight into the psyche of humanity. And so he wanted to keep bringing this understanding of these ideas to the world, and he ventured into alchemy to bring these forward. Now, alchemy just kept popping up and popping up and popping up, right? So it could even fade for a period of time, but then it would rise up again, and he'd get really, really interested in it again, and then it would fade off again, and then rise up again. Now, why was it constantly coming and going? Well, it wasn't because, he should have stuck to alchemy and only just focused on alchemy, but rather that was because, his career archetype, which was a psychologist, was expressing itself through being interested in this particular domain. And if you yourself are finding that your interests are just fading and you're trying to hold on to an interest and it just fades away, and then you try to hold on to another one and it just fades away, all that means is that you're not properly connected to this deeper core energy, this power, this foundational career archetype, and you want to go ahead and unearth your own to properly understand how that works and how to make sure it stabilizes. And if you want to know exactly how, then I guide people within our membership. You can check that out. I'll make sure I leave a link below. And this happened to me as well. I was into astrology, literature, also interested in alchemy and some of the occult and esoteric sciences, very into biography, history, different areas of more modern psychology, different areas of philosophy, particular philosophers, French philosophy. I like some of the ancient Greek stuff. Right? I was getting pulled into all these different directions. But it wasn't until I really unearthed my career archetype and understood how that career archetype was working and coming forth in the life, which was wanting to understand to the depths vocations, that I was probably able to see how all these interests were woven into the fabric of my path. Now, one other subtle sign that often appears for people that are on the wrong path is this constant feeling that you are an outsider, that you don't quite fit in to whatever group it is that you're amongst. Now, if it's in the workplace, it's feeling like you're kind of separate from everyone. Even if you try to bring yourself forward, it's always at a distance. It doesn't quite work. There's this discomfort in the chemistry of the group. And this discomfort and this feeling as though you're outside is an indication that you probably haven't figured out where you fit in, because you fit in somewhere. I promise you, there is somewhere where you fit in. There is a group where it just works. You match with. You're meant to be around these people or serving these people. If it's to connected with your vocation, there's a group that you're meant to be around and amongst. There's probably a couple of different groups that you have strong affinities with. And so when you feel like an outsider, it means that you're hanging with the wrong crew, right? You're hanging with the wrong group. You need to go and find your people, the people that you're meant to be around. And so this is a really, really subtle sign when you find yourself, saying that people that you work with, don't really like them, don't really hang with them. If I wasn't having to show up to my job, wouldn't hang out with them outside of work. Understanding that you don't feel comfortable in that way with these people, even to share more of yourself, right? Different parts of yourself, because when you're with a group that you're meant to be with, you feel a lot more comfortable sharing the honest truths within yourself, then something's going wrong. And a great example of this, if we look at it through this cultural lens, is Princess Diana. So Princess Diana was married into the royal family, and she immediately starts to find herself in tension with how they act, how they express, how they behave, their values, their principles. She comes in and it's just a bit of a war, right? She doesn't see eye to eye with how they go about life. So she's constantly feeling like this outsider within the royal family, and it never changes. Right? That's a really important point. It's not going to change. You're never going to become the insider in a group where you're already feeling as though you're the outsider. And she never is able to make it work in that way. However, she does find herself feeling very at home with other groups outside of the royal family. Groups that are, helping the sick, helping the poor. She has this real sense of humanitarianism. She really wants to go and help other people. She feels at home around like teaching children. And so when she's doing this through volunteer work, just being around the people, she feels very comfortable. She feels very calm. She feels very much at home. And if you are yourself noticing that you don't quite feel at home, even if you don't know where you do feel at home, then this is a subtle sign that, hey, this isn't the right place for you. I experienced this myself when I was working in an insurance claims assessor role. When I was around the people that worked in this environment, there were certain things that I was always like hiding or didn't want to share, didn't want to express, because I just didn't feel comfortable with other people's values and their impressions and their judgments on the certain things that I held dear. So there'd be certain books that I'd be reading and I just wouldn't really want to show anybody what I was reading. I wouldn't want to bring up certain topics because I'd know that if I did bring up a particular topic, then suddenly I have to deal with people that judge those particular topics. And yet when I started to transition and express the work that I was meant to be doing, I naturally started to connect with others who just got it, just understood it. There wasn't a need for explanation. They themselves were going through it in their own way, or they were there in their own way, and there was just this ease. And so if you are someone that is finding yourself around one of these places where there is just this tension, then once again, that's a subtle sign that, hey, you'll want to reflect on this because that might be the wrong path and that might be the wrong place for you to be. And if you are someone that noticed within any of these different signs that I mentioned that, oh yeah, I do joke a lot about the potential of wanting to quit, or I'm always trying to send memes to spike up my day a little bit, or hey, yeah, I did enroll in a course or some sort of coaching and it did feel really, really off, and I don't know why I completed that course, or I don't know why I took their instructions. If that has happened to you, then know that it's just a sign to open yourself up to it, to reflect on what's going on, and that'll help to bring to your awareness, like, hey, that might be the wrong path for you, and you need to reconnect into what it is that you are actually meant for. And if you want to learn more about how I guide people through that process of choosing the right career path with this really deep conviction, by unearthing their very own career archetype, we actually go over and I call it gathering self-knowledge. So we go over these different perspectives to get a real sense of who you are, because there are different pieces of yourself that you're not even aware of that I bring to attention through this unearthing process. We look at things like astrology, Jungian psychology, these different psychological barriers along the way of the path. We also look at all your different interests and get to the real essence of those interests, as well as the myth that's running underneath your life. If you're interested in going over that and going through that and coming to a sense of like, oh, this is my path and this is what I'm meant to be doing, then I would highly encourage you to check out our online community and 8-week course. And in that course, we also structure out the actual path that you're meant to be walking. And so we look at it not just from here's what your calling is, but also how do I walk it in the 21st century? How do I figure out the finances? How do I begin, like take the first steps, and what do those first steps actually look like? And if you're interested in going through that, then I'll leave a link below.